This is one of a series of good answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. Central to that question, of course, is the Bible's record of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And interwoven with that record are related stories, such as the arrest, imprisonment, and execution of John the Baptist. There are elements in the tale so dramatic as to raise questions. An angry queen, a seductive daughter, a foolish promise carried out unwillingly. Is it history, or the stuff of legend? Let's have a look at this sidelight in the story of Jesus. When we hear the name Herod, we're forced to ask, which one? After all, the Herodian family was a large one, and several of them appear in the pages of the New Testament at various times. Most of us would think first of Herod the Great, founder of the family, and remembered for his order to slaughter the babies of Bethlehem, in attempt to kill the infant Jesus. We read of him in Matthew chapter 2 and Luke chapters 1 and 2. This was only one of a series of murders he ordered in the waning months of his life, some of them among his own family, including his son, Aristobulus. But he was survived by 3 other sons, and these were appointed by Rome to rule over 3 segments of their father's kingdom. As Tetrarch of Galilee, Herod Antipas appears often in the Gospels during the time of Jesus' ministry, while Herod Agrippa I is the one we see mentioned most often in Acts. But look again at Herod Antipas. He is the one whom John the Baptist condemned for having illegally taken and married the wife of his brother Philip. He executed John, and then, hearing of Jesus' ministry, feared that Jesus was John risen from the dead. The Pharisees referred to him when they warned Jesus to leave Galilee, saying that Herod will kill you. That's when Jesus replied that they should go and tell that fox, I will drive out demons and heal people today and tomorrow, and on the 3rd day I will reach my goal. Luke 13:31-32. And when Jesus was finally arrested, Pilate sent him to Herod for questioning. You may remember that he wanted Jesus to perform a miracle for him, and when he would not, Herod just sent him back to Pilate for trial. Is there any evidence outside the Bible that Herod Antipas was a real ruler? Yes, indeed. Coins like this one confirm that he was, as the Bible says, Tetrarch of Galilee. Around the rim of the coin we can see Eta, Rho, Omega, Delta, Omicron, Upsilon, Herodu, of Herod, and Tau, Epsilon, Tau, Rho, Alpha, Rho, Chi, Omicron, Upsilon, Tetrarchu, Tetrarch. No doubt about it, then. Herod Antipas belongs in history. Let's look at Mark's account of how Herod imprisoned John. For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him, and wanted to put him to death. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. Mark 6:17-20. Well, we know that this situation could not continue indefinitely, and Mark tells us about that. But an opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you. And he vowed to her, Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half my kingdom. And she went out and said to her mother, For what should I ask? And she said, The head of John the Baptist. And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Mark 6:21-25. Trapped by such a foolish promise, Herod could do little. Mark continues, And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Mark 6:26-29. Now it's one thing to find coins that confirm Herod Antipas as Tetrarch of Galilee, but quite another to accept this lurid story as serious history. A king's party, where he is captivated by the charms of a dancing girl. In front of all his guests he makes a stupid, open-ended promise. The girl's mother takes advantage of the situation and prompts her to make a stunning request. And trapped by his own promise, the king agrees to kill an innocent man. Quite frankly, it sounds more like myth or legend than solid fact. For example, we think of some of the Greek myths about the loves of Zeus. When he was trying to seduce the princess Semele, she's not convinced that he's really the king of the gods in disguise. "What can you do to convince me?" she asks. "Anything you want," he bursts out. And Semele, too clever for her own good, says, "I want you to drop that disguise and appear to me in all your glory, as you do when you come into your own wife's chambers." Trapped like Herod Antipas, Zeus returns to Olympus and gathers up his lightning bolts. Returning in a blaze of fire, he cannot avoid burning Semele to ashes. She got what she asked for, but no one was happy. Or recall the legend of the princess Dido. Fleeing from her jealous brother, the king of Tyre, she came to North Africa. There she asked the Berber king Iarbas for a grant of land where she and her people could settle, but the king refused. Then she asks, "May I have just as much ground as an ox hide can cover?" And thinking this will be useless to her, he agrees. Then Dido cuts the ox hide into many thin strips and ties them together, making a string long enough to encircle a hill. She gets her land to found the city of Carthage, and Iarbas is stuck with an unwelcome neighbor. Another of those careless promises that come back to bite us. How do we know that John the Baptist's end is not just another legend? We know because we can read about it in the history of Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century A.D. Josephus was a leader in the Jewish revolt of A.D. 66 that led, eventually, to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70. A commander in Galilee, he was captured by the Romans and sat out the rest of the war. Afterwards, in Rome, he wrote 2 major works, the Antiquities of the Jews and Wars of the Jews. Here's an excerpt from the former of those. Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God. Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best, by putting him to death, to prevent any mischief he might cause. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned, and was there put to death. Did you note the name of the castle? Machaerus. Many ancient sites, whether buildings or whole towns, are still unidentified by archaeologists. But Machaerus was easy. Located east of the Dead Sea, it was never lost to archaeology. It occupied the top of a steep hill, and from it you could look west over the Dead Sea all the way to Jerusalem, and you could see far out to the east, and be warned of the approach of any enemies. It had line-of-sight communication across the Dead Sea to several of Herod's other palaces and fortresses as well. Here's a closer look at the remains of the castle, and a closer one still. The remains of the castle are well enough preserved that a three-dimension, computer-based model of the site is possible. Here we can see the wall and the three great towers that protected its perimeter, one of them removed in this view. There are the two-story living quarters, and near them, what every Roman-influenced palace must have, a bathhouse with its columned vestibule. And just beyond the bathhouse and next to the living quarters, the royal courtyard. Professor Josephus, who has worked extensively at Machaerus, points out that the royal courtyard there would have been the scene of Herod's dinner party. A semicircular apse marks the spot for the throne of King Herod and his successor, Herod Antipas. Located at the axial center of the peristyle courtyard, Herod Antipas would have sat in this spot while watching the deadly dance of his stepdaughter, Salome. So then, it turns out that what we read about Herod Antipas in the Gospels is solid history, confirmed by coins struck during his reign, by the account of the historian Josephus, and by a set of ruins on a dramatic Judean hilltop. Here is where Herod lived with his stolen wife. Here is where he imprisoned John the Baptist. Here is where he held a fateful birthday party for nobles and courtiers, and watched as Salome danced. Here is where he yielded to her request and executed John, presenting his head to the girl on a platter. Murder at the king's birthday party, just as the Bible says. If you have questions about this lecture, or any others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Four, at yahoo.com.